The funeral of South Africa's anti-apartheid icon, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, has been set for the 1st of January. That's this Saturday. His work as a spiritual leader and human rights activist crossed all denominations. And so, for more reflections on his passing, let's bring in Father Russell Pollitt, who's the director of the Jesuit Institute in South Africa, in Johannesburg, that is. Father Pollitt, of course, also giving us voice from the Catholic Church. And Father, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time. The Pope has joined a long list of global leaders who've weighed in on the passing of the Archbishop, saying that he is saddened by this development. Perhaps let's begin with your reflections as perhaps an individual within the clergy when you consider how Tutu used the church to bridge the many gaps we have in our society.
Good morning, Ayanda, and to all your viewers. I'd like to begin by offering my condolences to the Tutu family and to the Anglican Church here in South Africa after the passing of the Archbishop. I think the Archbishop was just an inspiration. You know, he's one of those people who I think had a very deep understanding of humanity and of human beings. And I get the deep sense that this came from his own contemplative life, his own spiritual life. He had this insight which was just beyond the surface. He could see underneath what was going on, and I think he had a great gift for that. I think to be able to bridge the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, with social justice was another gift of his and an inspiration. And I remember long before I was even ordained, I remember reading things that Tutu had written and listening to Archbishop Tutu and thinking to myself, wow, you know, this is the kind of clergyman I want to be. This is the kind of church I want to belong to. A man who was with the people, who never let anyone who was vulnerable or suffering or marginalized stay in that state, but rather went to them, didn't wait for them to come to him, but went to him. The many images I remember as a youngster of Tutu at funerals, that famous thing which I think is doing the rounds at the moment on social media of how he helped that young man escape a near-death experience in a township. That's the kind of inspiration which I just remember and I'm so grateful for.
Absolutely. And, you know, when you think about individuals like Desmond Tutu, you're almost drawn to the similarities that exist not only between the denominations within Christianity, but between all people of faith. You also kind of think about the relationship he had with the Dalai Lama, for instance, and how that was calling the world really to see into what we have in common than, you know, what divides us. And that's certainly a big part of the legacy he has, the type of legacy, ironically, that I think is also emulated by the current Pope.
I think so, Ayanda, and I think one of the things that I've thought in the last 24 hours reflecting on Tutu's life is, you know, he was the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town. He was an Anglican, and yet in some ways he was the greatest ecumenist of our times. In other words, he was someone who was able to reach across all the Christian denominations and even further than that, you know, other faith communities, as you've just pointed out. He had this ability to somehow tap into all of that, where everybody felt, in a sense, that he was also their spiritual leader. He wasn't just for a certain group, but he was for everybody. And I have a deep sense of his kind of ecumenical gift, being able to do that. And you draw a sort of parallel there with Pope Francis. I think that's what many people are saying, and I've heard this coming from other Christian denominations. I had a friend in Cape Town who was telling me he was at a meeting and there were a number of religious leaders there, and an imam said in this meeting, Pope Francis, our Father. In a sense, he saw the spiritual leadership of Pope Francis as well, going well beyond the Catholic Church. And I think Tutu was exactly the same, that I as a Catholic could be inspired by this man and felt like a real challenge by him as well in the way that I lived my own Christian life. I think he did that for people across the board. That is so right.
Yeah. The theology that the Pope, like Tutu, ascribes to also meant that they butted heads with many people within the church itself. One of the remarks that have been repeated several times since we heard of Tutu's passing was when he said he'd rather go to hell than going to a homophobic heaven. That almost sounds like something, dare I say, a Jesuit would say, but still, it's an individual who wasn't afraid to have those tough discussions, even in instances where he knows there's great disagreement.
Exactly. And, there was another comment he made one day as well. He was talking when he said, if you can show me in the Bible where apartheid is justified, I will take my Bible and I would tear it into strips. And a lot of people as well were quite scandalized by that. But I think that's true. I think, and this is the remarkable gift again of Tutu, and I think Pope Francis is the same. That it's the individual, it's the person that's important. We sometimes put all sorts of rules and structures in place, and we can so easily lose the person. But Christian neighborly love says that we should look at the person before us. And when people are victimized because of their sexual orientation or their race or whatever the case is, we have the responsibility to speak out. And I think that Tutu's remarks on gay people were ones that did. It shook the Christian community, as some remarks that the current Pope has made about gay people shook the Christian community. But it shows their deep love of humanity, their deep love of people, and most of all, the fact that God can transcend and God crosses over these boundaries that we as human beings put into place so easily, which don't necessarily always mirror what God would want. And I think the ability to challenge that in such a courageous and fearless way is something else which we will thank him for, and hopefully that challenge will continue to happen in the churches, because it's an internal challenge as well as an external challenge. I mean, very often within the churches we find a real homophobic sentiment. It's not just in society, but it's within the churches, and that needs to be challenged.
Yeah. I suppose you've answered this question already, but it may be worth asking explicitly. When you recollect the path that individuals like Desmond Tutu have taken, theologically speaking, in what ways do you reckon he's been able to successfully challenge how we see what God is actually about?
When I was studying, there was a book that we used in scripture called, for scripture studies, called A Liberation Perspective. And I think that for me, in many ways, when I reflect on Desmond Tutu's life, I mean, that's what he offered us, a liberation perspective, a liberation from many of the things that we put in place that doesn't allow us to be free, whether that's rules, whether that's structures, etc., etc. And I think theologically speaking, what people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu did, they presented us with a face of God, which was a face of mercy, a face of love, a face of forgiveness. One thinks just simply of his breaking down and his tears at the TRC when he was listening to the stories of what happened to people there. A real sense that our God is a caring God, a loving God, and before all else, if we cannot and do not see that God is a loving God, in a way we are worshipping, one could say, an idol, because mercy and love are the key elements of the Christian God that we believe in. And when we start to put our own spin on things and we don't allow that true image of God to emerge, then we'll end up with the divisions that we so often see and the fights. And Tutu transcended that, because I think his image of God was one of love and mercy and forgiveness. And that cost him too. We know that many people are also critiquing him for the TRC, but I think that that spiritual essence of Tutu is what kept his understanding and his vision and his personal encounter with God is what kept him courageous and fearless, and sometimes even opening himself up to the critique that in some quarters we're hearing.
Critiqued as he was, I think many people will say that he's managed to be a more effective missionary than those people perhaps who are sticklers for the scripture, so to speak. Father Russell Pollitt, always great getting your take. Thanks very much indeed for weighing in. As we continue taking stock of the impact this man has made, Father Russell Pollitt is the director of the Jesuit Institute in Johannesburg.